We Always Get Our Man by Ryan Williamson. Narrated by the author. Many a dime novel has imagined how Zarahemla Two Crows and I first met, and what prompted such odd bedfellows as us to embark on an adventure that would ultimately save the world from Armageddon. The truth is, dear reader, it all began in the late winter of 1875, when my commanding officer took seriously ill and attempted to devour my brains. This, then, is how it really happened. Having made the trek north to Fort Edmonton in the worst blizzard of the season, we found ourselves half frozen upon our arrival at the great wooden gates. If the harsh weather were not trial enough, we had lost the greater part of our horses to a raiding party of Blackfeet who, fortunately for us, were more interested in our mounts than our scalps. It was late in the night and exceedingly cold, made all the worse by a driving wind that blasted us relentlessly with blinding snow. As advertised, the life of a Northwest mounted policeman is never one for adventure. The night watchman ushered us in with great urgency to Rowan House, an impressive three-story structure dominating the center of the courtyard. I ordered water boiled and as many pelts and blankets as I could find. Several of the men were hypothermic and frostbitten, and I was forced to remove 2 of Sub-Constable Atwood's toes and Sergeant Rourke's left ring finger, lest they become gangrenous. After tending to my duties as surgeon, I took my leave of our commanding officer, Inspector McLaren, and retired to the gentleman's mess. The cook's boy had been roused upon our arrival, and was preparing our meal as I sat by the great fireplace in the large hall. By and by my comrades trickled in, taking their seats at the large rough-hewn tables. Soon the air was full with the haze of pipe smoke and the voices of rough men. I had devoured 1 bowl of piping hot stew and was making headway into a second when the door flew open in a great gust of wind. To our surprise, a colossal brown bear festooned with icicles and heavy mats of snow ducked in under the lintel. Several of the men began shouting and drew their pistols. Constable Robbins, given to a weak constitution, fainted dead away. Slamming the door shut, the bear threw down the latch and stomped its boots. It glared unconcerned at the firearms pointed in its direction, and pulled open its giant maw to reveal the dark, ruddy face of a man with deep-set eyes that glinted like diamonds. He scratched at his thick, gray-streaked beard, yawned, and tromped down towards the fireplace between rows of nervous troopers. I dare say I had never seen a larger man, or a more peculiar one for that matter, and I doubt I ever will. From the top of his wild nest of black hair to the bottom of his heavy nail-studded boots, he cut an imposing figure. His cloak, made from the skin of a grizzly, hung heavy across wide shoulders, and the room shook with every step he took. He passed by me without a glance and stood in front of the fire, warming his hands in silence. The cook's boy appeared beside him with a tankard of hot water, which the man took with a grunt of thanks. He threw back his cloak, revealing a great belt studded with high-caliber brass cartridges and a brace of large revolving pistols, and sat down heavily on a small stool. It groaned in protest. He had singularly striking blue eyes, like glacier ice, set under a heavy outcropping of thick bone and expressive steel-wool brows. If one had asked me to wager on the race of his forefathers, I would have not known where to place my bets. After a minute, the dusky man turned to me and pointed to the star on my lapel. "No disrespect, son, but ain't you young for an inspector?" "Surgeon," I replied, somewhat taken aback by the impudence of the man. "Well, assistant surgeon, specifically. I'm attached to Inspector McLaren's troop." He extended a massive hand and said, "The name's Two Crows. Zarahemla Two Crows." "Bonhomme," I replied, watching as his hand swallowed mine in a bone-crushing grip. He pumped my arm vigorously, nearly dislocating my shoulder. "Dr. Emmanuel Bonhomme," I continued, recovering my tenderized appendage. "I've heard of you, Mr. Two Crows. You're a scout for the detachment here, no?" "On occasion," he replied, pulling a long braid of chicory root out of his breast pocket. He clamped it between his teeth like a cigar. Firelight played across the shadowy creases in his boot-leather skin. "We received word they'd gone missing. That's why we're here. What happened?" He chewed on the chicory thoughtfully before spitting the juice into the fire, where it sizzled and danced on the glowing grate. "Done got themselves killed, I reckon," he said. "And you haven't thought to search for them?" He shot me a look that could have petrified a gorgon and growled, "I turned out in that godforsaken weather on a damned constitutional, Doc." "I apologize." "Look, son, I've been cutting for signs since before your daddy was sucking on your grandma's teat. If what took those men could be tracked, I would have found it." "Whatever sort of mischief our comrades in arms befell, we'll suss it out," I said with a confidence. "We always get our man." Two Crows leaned back and laughed so loud that the head of every trooper in the hall turned in our direction. You're stepping into territory beyond your ken, he finally said, slapping me on the shoulder. I wish you the best of luck, but if you value your hide, you'll sit this one out. We could use a seasoned tracker who knows the land, I proffered. Two Crows snorted. Not for all the tea in China. Huddled deep into my beaver greatcoat, I clenched my jaw to stop the chattering of my teeth. Wind cut through fur and wool like a lance, freezing the very marrow of my bone. As Inspector McLaren inspected our line of shivering troopers, the dappled mare under me pawed at the snow, her breath thick and heavy in the morning air. If McLaren felt the cold, he did not show it. Satisfied, he waved his arm in a wide circle over his head, and we rode out through Fort Edmonton's main gate in single file. Thick fog was rolling up the banks of the mighty North Saskatchewan, enshrouding us as we traveled in silence. For miles, all that could be heard was the creak of saddle leather and the jingle of spurs. It was a ghostly world, beautiful in its serenity, and yet haunting in its stillness. It felt as if time itself were frozen. The sun burned off the fog as we rode, and by mid-morning we ceased following the river and turned towards Father Lacone's small mission in the Sturgeon River Valley. It was McLaren's intention to question the priest about our missing comrades, and I was glad for the excursion, for it meant I could also see to the business of my immortal soul. From what I knew of Zarahemla Two Crows, it was an odd thing indeed for him to turn down any offer of employment. He was a hard old hunter and had a reputation for reckless boldness. His warnings, which had at first perplexed me, proceeded to gnaw at my mind until I had developed a sense of foreboding that set my spirit on edge. I am not a praying man by nature, but the West is a land steeped in mystery, and one's faith in rational explanations can easily be shaken. Bowing my head, I silently called upon St. George to watch over us. We rode. By noon we could see the small log chapel and outbuildings scattered among the tall pines. A thick blanket of snow had settled over the mission, and aside from a great flock of magpies flitting to and from the buildings and trees, we discerned no activity. A chorus of high-pitched nasal squawks assaulted the silence as they bickered with one another in agitation. I traced a weak trail of chimney smoke high into the sky, and noticed ravens soaring in a great lazy circle. McLaren saw them too, and gave the order to halt. We brought our horses into a line on a rise overlooking the mission. "Don't like the look of it, sir," Sergeant Brown said. He spit into the snow and smoothed his mustache. McLaren creased his hawkish eyes as he watched the ravens. "Sergeant, take a man and secure the perimeter." Brown nodded to Constable Young as he pulled his Snyder Enfield carbine out of its saddle bucket. The two men broke formation and rode off into the trees silently. "Keep sharp," McLaren said to the rest of us. He turned in the saddle and looked Constable Robbins squarely in the eye. "And don't get twitchy." I drew my Adams revolver as we started down the hill. Hippocratic oath or not, our run-in with the whiskey traders up at Fort Whoop-Up had taught me the value of a serviceable sidearm, and gone were any compunctions I might have had against perforating a man bent on violence towards me. Indeed, I took down one or two of the rascals myself in the skirmish, much to my satisfaction. We entered the mission grounds at a slow trot, fanning our line out in a wide crescent. Save for the rough chorus of magpies, all was still as death itself as we passed by the shuttered outbuildings. Corporal Franks, riding beside me, gave a low whistle and motioned with the bob of his chin. I followed his gaze to the corpse of a young Métis woman half buried in the snow. The birds had been working on the body for some time now, but something much larger had been at her first. While she was hardly my first cadaver, the young lady was a strong contender for the most gruesome, and she was far from the worst thing I would witness before this day was over. Robbins had dismounted and was standing beside his horse. He looked at us with panic in his eyes, gagged, and promptly lost his breakfast on his moccasins. Franks laughed and rode past him, around the woodshed and into the church courtyard. I heard him cry out and spurred my horse forward. Massacre is a flaccid word compared to what met my eyes when I rode into the courtyard. Franks was wiping the contents of his stomach from his lips with the back of a glove. He swore and looked at me in horror. He was a hard man, and had taken part in more than his share of bloody business, but I understood his terror. It filled me too. This was not the work of men. The frozen corpses of women and children filled the courtyard, some torn limb from limb, others ripped wide open from neck to navel. Black from the cold, with their faces locked in rictus, mothers and babies stared at us with hollow eyes. Our horses shifted nervously at the smell of so much death. McLaren backed up his horse, revealing a white man in a red jacket crouched over a body. His face was soaked in blood, and he looked at us with wild eyes as he sat on his haunches, grasping his victim's entrails and fingers stained with gore. In front of him lay the priest, flayed open like a book. The young Mountie snarled. "Here's we found one of our boys," McLaren said. He looked at me. "What do you make of this, Doc?" I dismounted and walked over to them, swallowing the bile in my throat. Years of medical training took over as I surveyed the grisly scene. To function as a physician, it is necessary to see people as the meat and bone we are, and repress instinctual sympathies. The crouching Mountie barked at me as I approached. McLaren was covering him with a carbine, and I cocked my pistol. We stood and watched him for a few minutes. Apparently satisfied that we did not come to steal his meal, the crazed young man resumed feeding on the old priest's bowels. "Well?" McLaren asked, hopping out of his saddle. "I've read of some cases of cannibalistic hysteria," I said, motioning to the bodies littering the courtyard, "but nothing on this scale or this violent." "He couldn't have done it alone," McLaren said. "You think he found them like this? Maybe bears? This poor devil's crazed with hunger. It's not beyond a starved man to scavenge on the dead." "We're animals," Frank said, riding up to us. "No claw marks, no tracks. This were done with the bare hands of men." "Men literally tearing women and children apart?" McLaren shook his head. "No, there's something else going on here." He put his rifle in the saddle bucket. Walking up beside the young man, he said, "What's your name, son?" A snarl through bared teeth dripping with blood was the young man's reply. McLaren bent over and shouted in his face, "I said, what's your name, son?" The young man pounced suddenly and tackled McLaren, clawing at his face with broken and bloodied nails. The two slipped on frozen gore and rolled in crimson snow. McLaren fought him off with one hand while he struggled to draw his pistol. Franks and I circled the melee, trying to get a clear shot, but they were moving too erratically. The young man gnashed his teeth inches from McLaren's face. The smell of his breath must have been overwhelming, McLaren retched. He kneed the man in the groin and stomach, but to no apparent effect. Finally freeing his sidearm, McLaren shot the young man in the chest repeatedly until they both collapsed. Panting, he sat up and spit into the snow. I rushed over to help him up, but the insane man's eyes flashed open and he dug his teeth deep into McLaren's arm, tearing away a large chunk of flesh. My superior grunted in pain and bashed the young man's skull in with the butt of his pistol until it was a featureless mess of brains and splintered bone. Franks clucked his tongue. "Well, that don't take the rag off the bush." "God, gasted," McLaren cussed. "Come on, sir. Let's get that arm taken care of," I said, helping him stand. "And where in tarnation were you two?" McLaren barked. "That maniac down near took my face off." Frank shrugged and said, "You was wrestling around like Perutan bobcats, couldn't get a clear shot." I pulled out my medical bag. "Let me see to that arm." McLaren composed himself as I rolled up his sleeve and tended to his wound. It was a deep, ragged hole in the flesh of his forearm, coloring rapidly with infection. I flushed it with whiskey from my flask and gave the rest to McLaren to steady his nerves. "I'll have to sew this up, sir," I said. It's been hurt." He dismissed my warning with a grunt and took a swig from my flask. The other men were hanging around the edges of the courtyard, jumping at shadows. McLaren looked up at Franks. "Get a detail to collect all the bodies, put them in the woodshed, we'll torch it, and search the buildings for survivors." "You know there ain't no survivors," Frank said. "Probably not." McLaren gritted his teeth as my needle and catgut thread snagged on his flesh. "But idle men get twitchy, best give them something to do." Franks flipped a salute off the brim of his fur cap. "So what did you call this, Doc?" McLaren said, looking at the pulverized young Mountie at his feet. "Cannibalistic what?" "Hysteria. That'll make a man survive multiple .45 caliber bullets in the heart at point-blank range?" "Unlikely." "So what's your prognosis?" "Sir," I said, "I have no bloody clue." He frowned and I finished bandaging his arm with an iodine gauze. "You'll have to keep that clean," I said. "It's already showing signs of infection." "Already?" "We'll just have to keep a close eye on it, sir." McLaren looked over my shoulder and nodded. "Looks like Brown found something." The sergeant rode into the courtyard with Constable Young. Between them was none other than Zarahemla Two Crows. I nodded to the giant man in the bearskin cloak, and he grinned back, spitting chicory juice from between his teeth. Brown saluted McLaren and paused, taking in the grisly scene at the inspector's feet. "We found more like that, westward of here, sir," he said in a voice as flat and cold as the Alberta prairie. "You done just got yourself nibbled on," Two Crows said, motioning to McLaren's arm. "Just a scratch," McLaren said. "You're a dead man walking, sure as I was born." It's hardly a mortal wound, I said. Two Crows shrugged. Infected already, innit? I dressed the wound myself. He'll be fine. By nightfall, you'll be like this one, Two Crows said to McLaren, pointing at the dead Mountie. Gnawing on your friends like so much raw beef. What are you saying, I asked. Are you implying this is contagious? Yup. Fiddlesticks, McLaren said. This is clearly the effect of hypothermia and starvation, resulting in her cannibalistic hysterectomy. Ain't that right, Doc? Hysteria, I corrected. That's one hypothesis. There could be other... McLaren cut me off and said to Brown, Where did you find this crazy old half-breed anyways? A large group left here this morning. He was riding their trail, braining the survivors they left behind with a hatchet. It was the only way to be sure, Two Crows added. In that case, why isn't this man under arrest, Sergeant? On account of the survivors trying to tear our throats out. Bullet between the eyes should work too, Two Crows mused, but I reckon it a waste of ammo. What in the Sam Hill is going on here? McLaren asked no one in particular. Recruiting, Two Crows replied, as if that explained everything. From the way we all stared at him, I guess he figured we didn't catch his meaning. He spit a long stream of chicory juice into the snow and snorted. He looked at us long and hard before saying, You take any thought to why all the dead are women and children? Where is all the men, aside from the handful of stragglers what tried to eat your faces, that is? I can honestly say that the thought had not crossed my mind. McLaren and Brown looked equally perplexed. Someone, something, is perverting the menfolk, Two Crows said slowly, like he was talking to stupid children. Building an army of darkness, soulless living corpses, the walking dead. Foul creatures fueled by human flesh. Oh, for Pete's sake, McLaren cut him off. Save us the melodrama. Brown looked concerned. Creatures? What kind of creatures? Like Wendigo? No, Two Crows said in earnest. Something much worse. He's pulling your legs, Sergeant. McLaren mounted his horse. He rode up beside Two Crows and said, Ride back to the fort, half-breed, and stay out of this. Stop spooking my men with your mystic nonsense. You hear me? Two Crows shrugged and gave a lazy salute in reply. He spurred his horse without a word, and as he rode by, he shot me a look that was equal parts amused and pitying. I watched him disappear into the forest and shivered, but not from the cold. We tracked the trail of shuffling footprints westward. Franks estimated that it was made by 20 individuals on foot, and at least one on horseback. Our quarry was moving at a rapid pace, and by mid-afternoon we were no closer to overtaking them. The sun, a ruddy disk on the horizon, cast long shadows behind us, for winter nights come early in the northern latitudes. As it sank behind the distant foothills of the Rocky Mountains, a bitter wind blew across the open plains, kicking up flurries of snow that blinded our horses and obscured the path. We were soon forced to stop and make camp. Inspector McLaren gave the order to dismount, and Franks grumbled that by morning the snow would hide the tracks. However, there was no going forward, and with the temperature falling so rapidly, any attempt to do so would be suicide. I attempted to helpfully point out that we could not see the trail any longer anyway, as the driving snow had reduced visibility to a few mere yards, and nightfall was rapidly closing around us. Franks repaid my observations with an obscene gesture and a handful of curses. We dug shelters deep into the leeward side of the snowbank and pitched canvas lean-tos overhead to protect us from the flurries. Sergeant Brown had the foresight to include one of the newfangled Rob Roy alcohol stoves in his kit, and proceeded to boil weak coffee for the men. We had no fires, as the largest timber that could be found were twigs perhaps as thick as a man's finger, and so felt ourselves greatly blessed to clasp a warm mug between freezing hands. After I had seen to thawing myself out, I lit a small hurricane lamp and found Inspector McLaren huddled in his dugout. He smiled weakly in greeting when I crawled in beside him. Fine evening, Doc. Beau temps indeed. Let's have a look at that arm, eh? His face was pallid and feverish under the glow of my lantern, and he ground his teeth in pain as I rolled back his sleeve. Black veins spiderwebbed out from under the bandage, creeping up the entire length of his arm. I carefully unwrapped the gauze and was immediately assaulted by the most putrid smell imaginable. Well, don't mince words, Doc. How's it look? I shook my head and wiped away the oozing asparagus-colored pus while my stomach heaved like a ship at sea. I'm not one to become nauseated easily, but the rancid, cloying odor was testing even my limits. This is bad, I said. His eyes met mine. After a long pause, I added, I don't think I can save your arm. Well, shit. We'll have to put a tourniquet on to keep the infection from your heart. At daybreak, we return to Edmonton so I can treat you properly. You mean so you can lop it off? Most likely. God damn, Doc, you have a god-awful bedside manner. I don't believe I've heard you blaspheme before, I said, genuinely shocked. He shrugged and frowned. Just found out I'm going to lose my arm. Maybe it's a good time to start. For some reason, this struck me as incredibly amusing, and we both laughed until tears were streaming down our faces. It was morbid and unbecoming, but sometimes laughter can be the best medicine. I dried my eyes and finished the unpleasant business of cleaning the festering wound, sprinkling it liberally with phenol and binding it with fresh iodine gauze. After I was done, I gave him a morphine tablet for the pain and tied off his arm above the bicep to retard the infection. Not exactly what you signed up for, is it? McLaren said. Eh? Sawing bones and treating young men for venereal disease? No, not particularly my dream when I entered the university. He laughed. Tell you what, Doc, let's find out who or what did this to our men, and then you can do whatever you want with my blasted arm. It would be suicide for you to leave this unattended. You know I'm not one to let that stop me. Discretion is the better part of valor, is it not? The difference between discretion and cowardice is a matter of perspective, he argued. With a weak smile, he added, and besides, like you're always saying, we always get our man. We will, in due time. I clasped his shoulder firmly. But first, my friend, you must get well. I'll get my kit and stay the night with you. He harumphed and turned over, wrapping himself in a tight buffalo skin. Crawling back out into the freezing gale, I finished conducting my rounds. The elements will maim or kill a man as fast as anything, and I was taking no chances that night. We already had several casualties laid up at Fort Edmonton, and I would be damned if I lost any more on my watch. After I was satisfied that the men were as safe from the elements as could be in our makeshift bayou, I fetched my haversack and sleeping roll. The horses were huddled together miserably, and, taking pity on the wretched beast, I detoured to feed them a bag of oats. The harsh wind was finally abating, and the flurries had calmed, revealing a fiery curtain of green and red shimmering in the northern sky like a great dragon stretched across the firmament. I was thus lost in reverie when I heard the first scream. The horses started and nearly trampled me in their panic. It was an unearthly howl, unlike anything I had heard before. It was the animal cry of a man torn limb from limb. Holding my lantern aloft, I stumbled through the heavy snowdrifts. Sergeant Brown's shelter had caught fire from his cook stove, and I watched in horror as he stumbled out covered in flames and holding his throat, which had been quite literally ripped out. Great fountains of blood pulsed from between his fingers, and he fell, writhing in the snow. Inspector McLaren stumbled out after him, clutching an arm that had been violently separated from its owner. The inspector was shirtless and awash head to foot in blood. He looked around with wild eyes as he gnawed on the limb. Corporal Franks burst out of his dugout with his Adams revolver drawn, followed by Young and Robbins, both grasping their Snyder Enfields like lifelines. McLaren saw them and threw his head back, wailing inhumanly. Without hesitation, Franks unloaded all 5 rounds into his chest, and Young hit him squarely in the shoulder, utterly destroying it in a shower of blood and bone fragments. Robbins' shot went wild, and I heard it whistle past my ear. To this day I cannot fathom how he missed by so wide a margin, for I was coming up behind him. McLaren stumbled, moaning, his arm hanging limply at his side. Franks and Young were scrambling to reload. Robbins stood rooted to the ground, paralyzed with fear. I had my carbine, but could not get a clear shot as they were between our homicidal commander and me. Shrieking like a banshee, McLaren charged them. He reached Robbins first, and with a swipe of his hand took most of the boy's face clean off. I could hear the vertebrae snapping from where I stood and saw Robbins collapse, dead on the spot. Franks drew his bowie knife and lunged, driving it deep into McLaren's gut, and the two fell to the ground, grasping and stabbing and clawing at one another. After fumbling several cartridges, Young managed to get one loaded. He stood over the 2 men and fired into both of them in panic. Frank slid off McLaren, clutching the hole in his chest and gasping for air. The inspector rose slowly, gritting his teeth. Frank's knife had eviscerated him, and his bowels spilled out around his feet. Young fumbled another cartridge, loaded, raised his rifle into McLaren's face, and fired point blank. The impact of the .577 caliber round snapped McLaren's head back, disintegrating one side of his jaw. He cracked his neck like a prize fighter and looked Young straight in the eye. In a blur of motion, he caught him by the scalp and ripped the young man's jugular out with his teeth. McLaren tossed him aside and looked at me. We stood a short 10 paces apart, and I didn't fancy my chances of running. He moaned softly. His tongue lolled out from the massive hole in his jaw, dripping with blood and saliva. He ambled towards me. I raised my rifle and tried to steady my nerves. At that range, one would think it impossible to miss, but straw men and a friend intent on devouring you are vastly different things. There would be no time to reload if I missed. I was shaking from cold and fear. Conditions were not, how would you say it, ideal? I sighted on his chest as we were trained, but as I was about to pull the trigger, I remembered what Two Crows had said, and at that last moment I raised my sights between his eyes and fired. Inspector McLaren buckled and fell. I skirted around the motionless body carefully and checked each of my comrades. All were dead. Collapsing in the snow, I stared at the carnage blankly. In retrospect, I know I was slowly freezing to death, but I felt nothing at the time. I truly believe I would have sat there until I perished if Two Crows had not found me. "Nice shooting, Doc," he said, walking his horse into our camp. My dappled mare followed behind. I nodded, looking at nothing in particular. "Yep, gotta brain 'em." He held a large lantern up high as he surveyed the camp. Lowering it to look in my face, he said, "It's the only way to be sure." I watched him as he went around to my fallen companions, giving each a solid blow to the brain pan with his hatchet. When he was done, he set the lantern on the ground and sat beside me, wiping blood spatter off his brow with a bandana. "So, what's next, Doc?" "Excuse me? What's your plan?" "Plan? What plan?" "Way I see it, you can sit here and freeze to death." He counted off on a massive finger. "Or you can come with me." He counted off on another finger. "And catch the son of a bitch. He started this whole mess." I sat beside the old hunter while he chewed on chicory. We sat for a long time, the two of us. Eventually he broke the silence. "Doc, my ass is near done frozen off. If you pick option number one, I ain't joining you. Just want to be clear about that." "Mad," I said. "So, you've made up your mind?" "Pittin' mad." I stood up and straightened my crimson Norfolk jacket. "What the hell, let's go. I'm an officer in the Northwest Mounted Police, and we always get our man." Two Crows heaved himself upright. "What the hell, let's go. I am an officer in the Northwest Mounted Police, and we always get our man." Two Crows heaved himself upright, and, handing me my horse's reins, said, "That's the spirit, Doc." We mounted and looked out to the western horizon. Dawn was breaking, and the sun painted the snowy peaks of the Rocky Mountains a glorious red. Spurring our horses, we rode towards them with the sunrise at our back.